Of all the jobs in the American air war over Europe, tailgunner was the one that other crew members didn't like to think about too directly. Not because it was rare, it was right there on the aircraft. They could see it. That was the problem. The tailgunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress sat in a small glass and metal enclosure at the very back of the aircraft, facing backward into the slipstream. He had 2.50 caliber machine guns, and a small piece of plexiglass between him and whatever was coming from behind. His job was to protect the bomber's most vulnerable angle. German fighter pilots had learned early in the war that a direct rear approach was the most effective attack on a heavy bomber. So the tailgunner was specifically there to counter that, and German pilots specifically tried to kill the tailgunner first. That fact alone tells you most of what you need to know about how long the average tailgunner could expect to stay alive. In 1942 and early 1943, before long-range escort fighters were available, American bomber crews flying over Germany faced loss rates that would have ended most military programs by administrative decision alone. Within those crews, the tailgunner position had some of the highest individual casualty rates of anyone flying. The average tailgunner in the 8th Air Force during the worst period flew missions knowing that the statistical probability of completing a full tour of 25 missions alive was somewhere around 1 in 4. That is not a metaphor for danger. That is the actual number. Before a tailgunner ever saw a German fighter, the turret itself was trying to kill him. On the B-17G, the tail position was a Cheyenne turret. The gunner kneeled on a small padded rest, bent forward at the waist, face about 8 inches from the plexiglass, looking through a reflector gun sight. There was no seat. There was barely room to shift weight from one knee to the other. The entire space was roughly the size of a phone booth, and the gunner was expected to stay in that position for missions that regularly ran 6, 8, even 10 hours. Getting in required removing the guns, crawling through a hatch built for necessity rather than comfort, reinstalling the guns from inside, and then waiting for takeoff. Getting out in an emergency, with the aircraft on fire and losing altitude, was a problem men thought about and tried not to think about. The temperature at bombing altitude over Germany was between -40 and -60 degrees Celsius. The tail position was the least insulated part of the aircraft. Heated suits were introduced, but unreliable. They shorted out. If the heating element failed over Germany in January, the gunner had bare minutes before frostbite began. Tailgunners regularly came back from missions with blackened fingers and toes. Some came back with worse. Frostbite serious enough to require amputation was not unusual, and it happened to men who had working suits that stopped working at altitude. At bombing altitude, without supplemental oxygen, a person loses consciousness in minutes. The oxygen lines froze, crimped, disconnected. Hypoxia produces a pleasant confusion before unconsciousness, so gunners who lost oxygen didn't always know it was happening. Men drifted off in their turrets. If nobody on the interphone noticed, they didn't come back. The guns threw spent brass casings that ricocheted around the small enclosure. The noise from twin .50 calibers in a confined space was physically damaging. Men who flew enough missions came back with hearing loss that never recovered, and all of that was before anything started shooting back. The Luftwaffe understood the geometry of the bomber formation better than most people give them credit for. By 1943, they had spent 2 years studying how to kill B-17 efficiently, and they had arrived at answers specifically designed around the limitations of where the defensive guns could reach and where they couldn't. The standard American bomber formation was a defensive box, groups of aircraft stacked and spaced so that the .50 calibers of each plane covered the approaches to the planes around it. Frontal attacks became suicidal for German pilots, because 6 or 8.50 calibers firing simultaneously from multiple aircraft gave an incoming fighter essentially no chance. So, German pilots largely stopped coming head-on and went around to the back. The 6 o'clock low approach was the standard Luftwaffe attack on a heavy bomber. A German fighter, usually an FW190 or BF109, would position itself well behind and below the formation, outside the range where the tail gunner could depress his guns far enough to reach it. Then it would climb while closing the distance and roll into a firing pass from directly behind. The approach gave the fighter pilot a huge target, the entire cross-section of the bomber, and gave the tail gunner a fast-closing, maneuvering target against the sky. The exchange was not even. Both aircraft were carrying weapons that could destroy the other with a handful of hits, but the German pilot was maneuvering through a prepared pass while the tail gunner was trying to track him from a kneeling position in a frozen box. German twin-engine aircraft like the ME-110 and later the ME-410 would position themselves outside the effective range of the .50 caliber guns and fire rockets into the formation. The rockets forced the bombers to maneuver, which broke up the formation, which opened gaps in the defensive coverage. The tail gunner watching a fighter outside his range firing firing rockets at the formation, was in the worst possible position. He could see exactly what was happening and could not stop it. By the time the fighter closed to a range where he could engage, the attack was nearly over. Passes lasted seconds. Men with fewer than 100 hours in a turret were making those decisions over Germany. On missions where the formation took heavy losses, the planes that made it back came in with holes in them, with dead and wounded still on board, with engines out, with hydraulics shot out, with gear that wouldn't fully deploy. The tail section absorbed a specific category of damage from fighters that had pressed their attacks through. Ground crews who worked the line learned to read the tail for how bad the mission had been. Sometimes the tail gunner walked out. Sometimes they had to help him out. Sometimes there was no one to help out. Men who had been in combat for more than a handful of missions developed what flight surgeons documented as operational fatigue. The symptoms were consistent: sleep disruption, hypervigilance, an inability to concentrate, emotional flattening that survivors described as being unable to feel anything strongly in either direction. Some men became unable to fly. They would reach the aircraft, climb in, and be unable to move. The official designation was LMF, lack of moral fiber, borrowed from the RAF, and it carried official stigma. Men who reported psychological symptoms risked having it noted in a way that followed them home. Most didn't report. They flew. The physical toll accumulated specifically for tail gunners. Kneeling for 8 hours on repeated missions produced chronic knee and back problems in men who were barely out of their teens. Hearing damage was progressive. Frostbite injuries reduced fine motor control in ways that lasted for life. Men who looked healthy when they got home were carrying things inside them that wouldn't fully surface for years. Completing a tour meant 25 missions. The Air Force raised that requirement to 35 later in the war as the loss rates fell. The logic was sound. Experienced crews were the most valuable asset the command had. The men who had already survived 20 missions understood the logic perfectly and hated it anyway. Some tail gunners flew their entire tour without firing in combat. Some were in engagements on nearly every mission. The difference was luck and assignment, not skill or courage. The tail gunner position was not assigned by random selection. Men were chosen partly by physical size, because the turret had hard limits, and partly by demonstrated aptitude on the gunnery range. But within those constraints, there was a self-selection process that produced a specific kind of person. Most tail gunners were young. Not young in the way that everyone in the war was young, but specifically 18 and 19-year-old enlisted men who had gone from civilian life to combat crew duty in under a year. They understood intellectually that the position was dangerous. They did not yet fully understand what that meant in practice, and by the time they did, they were already in it. The relationship between the tail gunner and the rest of the crew was structurally unusual because of the physical separation. On a B-17, the tail gunner was 65 feet from the pilots. He communicated through the interphone, and his voice was the primary way the crew knew he was still there. When the interphone went quiet from the tail, someone had to physically crawl back through a freezing fuselage to check. Men who made that crawl described it as one of the things they thought about most afterward. 10 men who flew together long enough developed bonds that survivors consistently described as unlike any other relationship in their lives. The tail gunner, isolated at the back, was both the most alone member of the crew and the man the other 9 depended on to cover their most vulnerable angle. He sat alone at the back and did it anyway. The ones who didn't make it back were not always killed. Some were taken prisoner. Some were listed as missing, which was its own kind of loss for families who received those notifications and spent the rest of the war not knowing. Pilots who had a dead tail gunner in a crippled aircraft had to decide whether to land with a dead man in the turret. They made that decision more than once. They landed with their tail gunners. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had lost over 26,000 men killed and another 28,000 taken prisoner. Those numbers come from an air campaign that lasted roughly 3 years over Europe. They represent a casualty rate that, proportionally, exceeded the infantry casualty rates in most ground campaigns of the same period. The tail gunner became a specific symbol within that larger loss for a reason that is not hard to understand. He was alone, he was visible, and his position existed because the enemy was specifically trying to come in from behind. Every crew member knew that what stood between a fighter attack from 6 o'clock and the rest of the aircraft was one man in a box at the back. The arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts in sufficient numbers in early 1944 changed the loss rates dramatically. Tail gunners who flew the later war had a different experience from those who flew in 1943. Both called it the same thing. After the war, those men returned to lives that from the outside looked ordinary. They went back to Kansas and Ohio and Georgia and the Bronx. They got jobs, got married, had children who grew up not knowing what their fathers had done because the men didn't talk about it. Not because they had nothing to say, because they didn't know how to make civilians understand what it meant to kneel in a frozen box at 25,000 feet over Germany while fighters tried to kill you and your friends. Then land, eat dinner, sleep, and do it again 2 days later. A handful of airworthy B-17S still exist. The tail turret on a restored aircraft, when you actually climb into it and look back through the plexiglass at where you came from, is the fastest way to understand what those men were doing. It is very small, it is very cold, and there is nothing behind you but sky.